I have been asked to speak to you with the title, "We Were Right All Along." Why? Because we think the Club of Rome was right all along. In 1972, we published a book called The Limits to Growth, Grenzen des Wachstums. And in it, we analyzed 5 factors. This was not a book about economics. This was a book about what we now call the ecological footprint. So the impact that humanity has on the planet. And we looked at population, and we looked at food production, and industrial output, and the use of scarce resources, and pollution. And we said that if we wanted to continue developing at the same pace, if we wanted to continue growing our economic systems as we had during the 1960s and the early 1970s, then the world would have a crisis around the middle of this century. When we've gone back and looked at the forecasts that we made, and we look at the predictions about what would happen to population and what would happen to food production and what would happen to pollution, the forecasts we made were exactly correct. Not slightly, exactly. And so today, we're in a situation which we call overshoot. The world has a certain capacity for us to live, a certain amount of raw materials, a certain ability to withstand human life. And we've gone through that limit. Now, it sounds impossible, but you can do that for a short time. Today, we live as if we had 1.5 planet Earths. And if we encourage countries like China to have the same standard of living that we do in Europe today, we would need 4 planet Earths. It's simply not possible. And so, we see the beginnings of all the problems that we predicted in 1972. The most obvious of those is climate change. But we see it with species loss, with the rise of pollution, with the migration problems, which are also part of the problem of inequality and climate change, and also with the financial crisis. They all hang together. They're all part of the same problem. And that problem is the economic system that we have today, the capitalist economic system. Why? First of all, we believe that we have to have economic growth. That economic growth is essential to all we do. Now, it may be hard to believe, but 40 years ago, people didn't believe that. But today, we believe we must have growth, and that means we have to use more and more resources to achieve that growth, and using more and more resources means we create more and more pollution. That means we burn more fossil energy, which means we create more CO2, which means we create the entire climate change problem that we have today. The economic system also creates unemployment. We think that growth creates jobs, but actually that's not true. It's one of the great lies of the economic system. If you look over the last 25 years in the rich world, we've had some of the fastest economic growth in human history, and yet unemployment has gone up. It does this because economic efficiency requires us to produce ever more and to reduce the costs ever more. And so built into the system is a desire to create unemployment. It wants to lay people off, to make robots and machines do the work because that's more efficient and it increases profit. So the economic system actually increases unemployment. It also, as the French author Thomas Piketty said, it increases inequality. The gap between rich and poor actually gets wider with the current economic system because what it does is it rewards the rich. The profits go to the people that own the companies, that are able to lend their money to the poor, and so they get the interest income as well. And so the rich automatically get richer all the time. And again, the system pushes the costs down, which means the standard of living for most people in the world in the last 30 years has been going down. In fact, inequality today in the rich world, the gap between rich and poor is wider today than it was in 1914. So more than 100 years ago, 100 years of economic development, and the gap between the rich and the poor is bigger. And if you look at the gap between the rich world and the poor world, it's bigger today than it was in 1820, nearly 200 years ago. So all this economic growth, all the Industrial Revolution, all this progress has widened the gap between rich and poor. And yet the economists tell us it will do the opposite. The other thing the current economic system does, and this is the chapter of the book that you can see here, the chapter that I've written about, is it ignores something called externalities. Now that sounds like a technical economic term. But when we burn fossil fuels, we create CO2 and other gases, and that creates climate change. Now the economists don't count that. When they look at the economic system, they ignore all of those consequences, and those are called externalities. When we dig up oil, we pollute the land. That's regarded as an externality. When we chop down the rainforests and kill all these species, that's regarded as an externality. The entire economic system fails to count for nature. But anything that cannot be turned into money, it ignores. And that's a fundamental problem with the entire system. The other great myth about the current economic system is that it helps the poor. That the poor world, and you see this, and I have to confess that I used to work for The Economist magazine, and I feel slightly embarrassed about that today. But The Economist and lots of other economists say that they're very proud that in the last 30 years, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. And they say that proves that our system works. But they're not telling the truth. Firstly, more than half of those people are in China. And China is not yet a capitalist economy. It's very much a directed, government-controlled economy. And it has a very unique economic style. But secondly, they tell you that the poverty level is $1 a day. And then they increased it in about 2000 to $1.50 a day. And they say that's the minimum level that we are going to count as poverty. But actually, if you take account of inflation, the real poverty level is about $3 a day, if you compare it to 1980. And using the correct measure, that all this development in the last 30 years, the number of poor people in the world, the number of people living in absolute poverty has gone up. So they're telling a vast lie about unemployment, they're telling a vast lie about inequality, they're telling a vast lie about poverty, and they're telling a vast lie about nature. The economic system is taking us literally into a dead end. And the consequences are clear. Climate change, and we really have to do something about that very quickly. Species loss, we're losing thousands of species. Pollution, I spent many years living in China and Hong Kong. And I tell you, the pollution in some parts of the developing world makes it very difficult to live a good life. But not just the air, we're polluting the waterways, the seas, the oceans, to levels that are simply unsustainable. And we're having this anthropogenic destruction. There was a quote from NASA a few weeks ago that because of the melting ice caps, the planet has actually tilted very slightly on its axis, because we're changing the weight distribution of the ice on the planet. And it's not just the environmental problems. We have lots of social problems. We have more conflict today because of the economic system. The reason we have so many Syrian refugees is not just because of the war. It's also because of climate change and because of inequality. So many of the people coming from Africa as well are becoming because of inequality. The gap between rich and poor has become too great, and the fight for resources too strong. We've seen this widening of the gap between rich and poor, and we've seen this stubbornly high unemployment. The system is failing, just as we said. So we were right all along. There are three basic options we face as a species. Because we've got probably 20 years to stop what we're doing to the climate, and I mean stop it, not just bring it slower down. And that's not very long. The three choices are: one, we can have some sort of people's revolution. We can have some uprising of people to stop this, to overthrow the governments, because the governments are not acting as they need to. They're not making the changes that we need as a race, as a people, to ensure that we can survive, that our grandchildren can survive. I don't think that's going to work, because the forces on the other side, the corporates, the capitalists, are very well informed, very powerful, have a great deal to lose, and very well armed. So a revolution is not the way forward. The second option is to do nothing. One of my colleagues in the Club of Rome, a German, Franz Josef Rademacher, believes that this is perhaps the only path we can follow, that we have to wait until the collapse is bad enough, and then we waken up and we make the changes. But much as I don't like to disagree with Franz Josef, it's too late by then. If we wait until the crisis, then it's too late. We have to act now. And so the third option is to gradually change the existing system. Not using the conventional policies, we need new and unconventional policies that redistribute wealth, that help the poor, and that control the corporations. And that's really what the Club of Rome is working on today. And this is why I'm so keen to support this initiative here over the next week. Because it raises awareness. It helps everybody understand in a different and very creative way that we need to change. And I very much hope that we can create some of that momentum that will move us towards a better world in the next 10 days. Thank you very much.